What do we want with the Bible? For example, when we give students or people going to church, when we give them the translation of what difference does it make when we translate it as slave or as servant? For example, when it comes to Mary or Paul, if we translate servant, then it's somehow not giving them associations about slavery in modern times. It's somehow saying it's telling a different narrative. Can I say that? A word is telling a very different narrative. And of course, when we translate from Greek, it's not like it's a one-to-one. We always have to think and interpret and do some choices when we translate.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Marianne Bjelland Kartzow, and this is the fourth installment in a series of interviews covering the book Ancient Slavery in its New Testament Contexts. I'll just leave this as a short introduction. So if you want to support the podcast, follow wherever you're listening if you're not already. Leave likes, comments, all that kind of stuff. Go follow us on social media if you're over there. If you're on Facebook, Instagram, Spoutable, Threads, Twitter, WordPress, Tumblr, any of those different platforms, or subscribe wherever you get podcasts, including YouTube. You can also become a supporter for $5 a month on Patreon. And that gets you not having to hear this pitch, and it also gets you episodes 10 days early. So let me know if there are any other incentives you think I could offer or should offer over there on Patreon, and I will do my best to make that happen. Yeah, that's all from me. Enjoy my conversation with Marianne Bjelland Kartzow. Marianne Bjelland Kartzow, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I will. I'm professor of New Testament Studies at the University of Oslo. And I work on ancient texts, particular New Testament texts, but also more broadly, sacred scriptures from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I teach students from different programs, and I do research, both here in Norway and also internationally.
This is completely off topic, but what's the weather like in Oslo right now?
Well, now we have sunshine. And we have almost sunshine the whole day and the whole night long. So it's warm-ish today and blue sky. And heading towards summer, I would say.
I forget that there are parts of the world where you have sunlight for a really long time. Do you use blackout curtains or like a sleep mask, or how do you get sleep at night with that going on?
I mean, especially in the north of Norway, there's really midnight sun already. It's completely sunshine all day long. There you need curtains, you need face masks, you need. Some people sleep less in the summer because it's so light. So, yeah, it's a hard thing to fall asleep.
Okay. I mean, I know that I don't want to derail the whole conversation and just talk about that, but that is really interesting. Like, there's not much deviation for us farther south down here. So, but okay. Well, welcome. And today we'll be discussing your chapter from the book Ancient Slavery in its New Testament Contexts, which is titled Metaphors of Enslavement. And we were talking before we started recording, and this is one of those, I get the book and I start reading, and I want to talk to all of you. So I did feel like, yeah, man, it's a quick little chapter for a very broad topic. So if you want to bring in things from your book, that's great. If you want to come back and talk about the book later, that's fine. Mm-hmm. This is a hospitable place. So you're the guest. You get to talk about whatever you want. But metaphors of enslavement, that is so broad. Where do you even start when you're studying a topic like that?
Well, very good question. I think I started with paying attention to texts in the New Testament about slavery. I was interested in general, what is this slavery? How is it significant of the ancient world? How does it look like slavery we have in more recent history? What is this slavery? That was my open question. And I realized that many scholars over the years have been concerned about that and asked the same question: what is slavery? How can we understand slavery in the Bible and in the New Testament? But then I saw that many of these texts were not only talking about slaves, for example, in parables, or slaves as, treat your slaves well, or don't hit your slaves, or whatever. It was also texts that talked about the believers as slaves of God, or slaves of Christ, or slaves of Jesus. And I got very curious about, okay, we have troubles understanding what slavery is, but how on earth shall we then understand the metaphor where slavery is used? How on earth can we really grasp what this is supposed to be talking about? And what does it mean that Paul, the Apostle Paul, starts his letters with presenting himself as a slave of God? How does that make sense? We know he was not a slave for real, but what did it indicate that he could use slavery as a metaphor when presenting himself? And then I just started to find many texts that I found interesting about this slavery, not only slavery as describing persons or institutions, but also as used as more figurative speak, or as, not as plain language, but as a metaphor. I got very curious about that.
And so, okay, I'm glad you brought the part up about like, well, how do we even know what slavery is? So when you get a metaphorical use, which there seem to be varying degrees of that, so I guess Mary might be a good place to begin, right? If you're reading in the New Testament, she definitely shows up before Paul. It seems a little less metaphorical if we're looking at this character, this figure, whose body is actually involved in something that is someone else's, i.e. God's, priority or objective. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of literal, right?
Mm-hmm. That's one of those texts I've been working most with. It is in the Gospel of Luke. Early in the Gospel, we maybe remember this scene where Mary is asked whether she can be the mother of Jesus, to rephrase it, and she's talking about herself. She's naming herself in that dialogue with Gabriel. She says, "I am the slave of the Lord." If we go into translations, for example, in Norwegian or in English, you will probably see that she is quoted as saying, "I am the servant of the Lord," or servant of Christ, or God. Some translations also have slaves now recently, but I find very interesting that Mary in this context is saying, is somehow imitating a slave in the ancient world. She's saying, "I'm the slave of God. Do whatever with me as you want to, or as according to your words." So I think that is the most, to me, that's the most curious place where I think we have to dig in order to understand. And I have to say that when I pay attention to metaphors, I'm inspired by those scholars who talk about metaphors as not only literary, not only way of speaking, but also way of embodying. That a metaphor, in order to make meaning of a metaphor, you draw on bodily experience, you draw on the history, you draw on your cultural ideas, you draw on what kind of context you're born and raised in. Of course, that means that when you hear a metaphor, you might get different associations than I do, which is completely natural. Although we live in the same time, we live on the different continents, we have different life stories, we come from different cultural impacts. So I think that is extremely important, both when we talk about metaphors today and how we use them, but in particular when we work historically and ask questions about ancient metaphor. How on earth can we understand how they were thinking? What did they think when they heard a metaphor? It's even challenging to talk about it when we live in our contemporary world and to decide what a metaphor can mean. So I think that is what is so interesting with Mary. What kind of, when people in the ancient world read this or heard this, "I am the slave of the Lord," when she replies that, how did they make meaning out of that? What kind of ideas, or what kind of background information, what kind of cultural baggage, what started to turn in their head, or what shall we say, what started to happen when they heard she saying that, or for that sake, Paul saying that? And my idea, inspired by metaphor theory, is that people heard different things. When Paul said it, it had one meaning, but when Mary said it, it had another one. Because there are In the New Testament, they play very different roles.
So what would be the significant difference between Paul saying it and Mary saying it then?
Yeah, I think very easy. He's in the New Testament. He's an apostle, and he's a man, and he's not using his body in the metaphor. I'm going to explain a bit more about that. So he's an apostle with very special status and authority in the context, and he's also a man. And he's saying, "I'm the slave of the Lord," and then he just continues, "Honor and glory be with you, my brothers in Christ," or something. He just continues. That's just a frame he's using, his formulation he's using. And then in the Gospel of Luke, Mary is, first of all, it's Luke writing, not Mary. That's also one difference between Paul and Mary. Luke describes Mary in a context where she is somehow doing something specific, something typical of women in the ancient world. She is asked to deliver a son. She's asked to be pregnant. She's asked to do something on behalf of God in a way. And she is doing what female slaves in the ancient world were, what shall I say, not famous for, but that was the main value, value of female slaves. It was that they could, of course, increase the stock of slaves. They could be pregnant and produce more slaves. So female slaves in a certain age were very attractive, and they also had a high economical value because of this capacity of childbirth. And we even read in some documents that it's calculated, okay, this woman, she's 20 something, she has a healthy body, she has no mistakes, she probably will survive 4 birth or 3 birth of children. So then she's valued higher than, for example, a man on the same age, or as an older woman who will not have survived so many births. So that is a typical task, I could say, for a female slave. That is to be pregnant on behalf of the owner. It could be, of course, with the owner himself, or it could be with someone else. That wasn't so important. The important thing was that that baby was a new slave. That baby produced by a slave mother became one more slave and one more slave and one more slave, if she survived. Otherwise, I mean, it was just one gain and one, you got one and you lost one. So that is a discourse or a discussion in the ancient world that I think can illuminate what's going on in that passage when Mary says, I will do as you want to. And then somehow I think she imitates, or she echoes, or she's doing some of the typical work of a female slave. And when then she's even naming herself slave, I think that's a little sign to us what kind of reality she is doing in that text, or she's saying, I'm willing to do, or not really willing, but she said, I will do what you say. I'm your slave. I will do what you say.
So that is a question that I had was, I mean, I'll just throw this out there too, because I want to make sure I don't forget to say it at all. But the distinction between slave and servant, I would like to go into that at some point. But here, the question of willingness or consent, I suppose there's a narrative that an enslaver could have that, like, well, the expectation is that they don't resist, and when they don't resist, that's as much consent as they get. So there will never actually be, contextually in the ancient world or any situation where there's enslavement, the kind of consent that we tend to, I'm in the US, you're in Norway, the kind of consent that we would broadly expect in an instance like this. So is there consent, or is there a kind of consent?
Yeah, that's a very important question to ask, I really think. And of course, slavery in the ancient world was also diverse. And we have very limited sources to this. Slaves were not significant. They were just mentioned in the bypassing, in footnotes in a way. So it's not like anyone have discussed in the ancient world, shall we listen to slaves when they say no or something. It's just that they are owned property, which means that as you own your cow or your dog or your sofa, if they have sofas, you own your slave, which meant that the slave owner had full control, could send the slave away, could punish the slave, could have sexual intercourse with the slave, could do whatever he or she wanted with the slave, could even kill the slave, but that wasn't very useful because then they lost property. Why should you kill your cow or destroy your sofa? So the slave had some kind of protection because they were capital. They were money in a way for a slave owner. And if you maybe had 3 slaves, of course you had to treat them well. Otherwise, what if they died? What if they got bad health or unhappy? So I imagine that although we don't have sources, they were human. They were humans. Of course, they were humans, and they could even be part of emotional transaction. Of course, a slave owner could fall in love, and a slave could fall in love with the owner. I mean, there's a lot of things going on, but from the documents we have, the way the owner treated the slave was like a surrogate, like someone who did something on behalf of them. A slave could, for example, take punishment if there were a law court. The owner could send the slave to take the punishment instead of them. So it's somehow they are not really humans. They are not really persons. They are not really, thought of as peers in a way. They were, so of course they were humans, but they were not considered humans. And in that context, I think we have to ask, so did she say yes? Did a slave accept this? In the Hebrew Bible, there are stories also about slaves that get pregnant and produces sons for their owners. For example, the famous story about Sarah and Abraham, where Hagar is used as a solution when they cannot have children. Then they come up with the idea, we have the slave girl from Egypt, Hagar. And then we just hear that he went into her or something. It's not like, but is this okay with Hagar? That's not expected to be a discussion, because Hagar was sexual property. She was reproductive property. She's not saying anything in that dialogue. Hagar is saying something else because she was the first one to name God in another story. So Hagar is after all not so insignificant. But in that context, she's just used as a reproductive body because that was the law, that was the economy, that was the deal in a way. So in that respect, Mary in Gospel of Luke, it's very difficult to compare this, but as I read the story, I think, at least in contrast to other stories we have, at least she is some kind of a dialogue where she can say or confirm, I'm your slave, do with me as you want. Is that the consent? Is that yes? I would rather say she, in her position, accepts the suggestion in a way. But it's and maybe that was unusual for female slaves to be even asked or to be even in a kind of a dialogue.
Wow, there's a lot there. So, well, and I'm associating some of the things that you said with other contributors to this book that I know I've spoken to. So, and I had to go back because I was like, which one was it? Was it Javal Coleman or was it Chance Bonar? So I've had them both. The episodes aren't out, but they will be by the time that this comes out. But I know Javal Coleman talks about Augustus going to someone's house and this guy's being really abusive to his slaves. And Augustus because the slave broke a plate or something, and Augustus has his men just smash all of this guy's stuff because that's not how you're supposed to treat your slaves. And it's like, okay, so there was a standard or an expectation, but it only matters with someone who is of higher status than you can call you out on it. And it's because, and Catherine Shaner, I think, did the household codes. So thinking about the household code, that this all kind of comes back from everyone within the household is some kind of an extension of the paterfamilias, right? And even more so the enslaved people, to where I don't know that I was aware of that you could send them in lieu of yourself to receive some punishment, presumably a physical punishment, and it just makes it sound so much worse and so much farther removed. I think and you gave your answer, and I don't want to undercut that. It almost seems like consent is irrelevant, that we actually have a different set of values foundationally to how we think society should run, and we look a little bit more at human autonomy. And maybe there's a little bit more friction for us when we're trying to figure out how people associate with one another as autonomous individuals. But we're we're performing the same project, just with a different set of understanding. Does that make sense? Does that work?
Yeah, and I think that's why I think that to pay attention to slavery helps us see that, because it is very different from the way we organized ourselves, and I think the best way to imagine how it is that to mistreat a slave was to mistreat the owner, So it's not like the slave had a capacity to be mistreated or some dignity or anything. It was bad to mistreat a slave, because then you were insulting the owner of the slave. It was as the slave was a tool or a vehicle in a way, not really a person in itself, which was part of the discourse. That was the way a slave society works. That was the way the ancient slavery works. That some were free, and they had certain rights, and they had certain privileges, and they could of course lose their status, and they could be kidnapped, or they could become enslaved in war. They were not like solid. If you were born as a free person, you were never fearing slavery. I think they were fearing slavery. I think that was a dynamic in the society, that you were never safe as a free person. You had to take care of your reputation, your slaves, your wife, whatever. But I think to recast what is a human, I think slavery helps us to do that, because we have material that shows us, even the New Testament, that shows us that some human beings were not considered human beings in the same way as others, which is of course our society. We have issues with this too. We have hierarchies, we have systems that are oppressive, for sure, but it's different from the ancient world, and we need to do a detailed historical study in order to see what's significant there and what is understandable. And that's why I think the slavery metaphor is even adding to that, because it is about understanding how people felt and imagined and conceptualized. It's not only there's a slave, it's a metaphorically he is a slave, metaphorically she is a slave. That makes a difference. Okay, what kind of different? And maybe someone in the audience didn't even think of Mary as a slave. They understand, she's a prominent person. She's just entitled like a slave, like a servant of the Lord. And then she's being pregnant for the Lord. Okay, that's not oppressive. That has nothing to do with gender. That has nothing to do with power. It's just, she's just a good, devoted person. Maybe someone had that idea, but I don't think so. Because I think slavery was so strong at the outset. When they heard a slavery metaphor, they immediately thought about slave experience, their own or others. I think that was at the top of their head.
So to get back to Paul for a minute, because I am kind of putting some, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think I'm putting some pieces together of things that I know from the Pauline corpus, okay, so you have this concept of Evangelion, which is like, hey, good news, I'm here, we're victorious, like we all win together, right? You're on my side, and I'm proclaiming this victory. So Paul is saying, hey, good news, I'm a slave of Jesus. But Evangelion would be the word used on the victor's side of war, and doulos, am I saying that right? Mm-hmm. Would be used on the loser side of war. And he seemingly is blending these, right? Because there's this idea of solidarity in Jesus' crucifixion and in Jesus' resurrection. So it actually, I don't know, going into this conversation, I was I'm kind of frustrated. It really does seem like Paul's just getting away with using this language. But as I'm listening to you, I'm kind of piecing some things together that, like, oh, he really is flipping a lot of things on their heads. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, but the problem is we do not really understand Paul. I don't think it's possible to understand Paul, and I don't think I think it's not just one Paul. Paul is so many things. He has so many voices, and he says so many different things. I just think that's important to be aware of. But what is most interesting to me is not only what Paul thought or what's his project. I'm interested in how it landed. How did what he said, the texts we have, how did they create something in those who read them, who received them, who heard them, because they couldn't read most of them, they were hearing texts. So I'm interested in what kind of meaning potential lies in all these texts. And how did the different things he said, for example, about slavery and the language he used, how did that make meaning? How did different people with their different backgrounds, how did they cope with it? And was it, of course, some of Paul's letters and something of what he's saying is, it's somehow radical. He's not alone about saying it. For example, here's neither Greek nor Jew, slave nor free, man or women. That's not commonplace. It's not completely everybody said it, but there are also other that said it. So he has some places where he's really radical in a way, but also he's also completely a product of his time, which is, of course, we are all products of our time. He can't think outside of his box in a way. Although he has had this experience and he's somehow find messiahs and everything, he's still a privileged citizen in the community, in the world he's living in. And that's why he himself is a metaphorical slave. We do not know whether he was a slave owner. We don't know, but at least we know that he's writing to slave owners. He talks to the people that they shall treat their slaves well, which is good for slaves, that they will be treated well. But he's not addressing the slaves. He's not saying, he's primarily keeping on that level, so to speak. So what was Paul's project? I don't know, but I'm curious about it, and I'm curious about how ancient people, those who were the addressees, those who were supposed to read these letters, what they thought, what it meant for them.
I mean, I think it is telling that, for example, so much of American history, and I would refer listeners to the episode I did with Mark Knoll on his book, America's Book, but so much of American history has really been either dealing with slavery as an institution or reeling from the problems that it led us to even after its abolition in this country, that race relations and economics and all of that stuff, they're all there. So, but the New Testament was used as a justification, and there is the same status thing that I referred to before, where like, yeah, Paul is a higher status person in these communities, and he's coming in and saying like, hey, treat them well. But clearly cruelty still existed because, close to 2,000 years later, we were still having an argument about like, is it even okay? And like, what is acceptable treatment? And we know that there were horrible dehumanizing, I think, to kind of grab a hold of what is a human discourse that you want to be involved in. Like, what is a human man? Like, it's not like biblical texts were clear in directing people as far as what they should do. And even Paul does use Hagar and Sarah as a theological point. So it's so deeply ingrained in his society and in society well after him. Yeah, your point is well taken. I guess I was just wondering, like, it really does seem like there's some contradictory images there where he's saying like, I'm a slave of Jesus, I'm a slave of God, and also here's this proclamation of victory, which would, it seems like, be historically associated with some kind of liberation from enslavement, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the best way to read Paul, that there are impulses in all directions there. And for example, this passage about where slaves are addressed by Paul, and Paul says, "Don't let slavery trouble you. Don't. It doesn't matter anymore." Basically, saying, because now you are freed persons in Christ. Now you have salvation, so you shouldn't care about the status you're in now. And in order to understand that statement, I think we have to take into account that Paul and the first Christians, they thought they were living in the end times. They thought it was very short until Christ came back. They were just, maybe this generation, they were really impatient. They thought that it's happening very soon, and they behaved accordingly, and they wrote accordingly. And of course, then, if there's just 10 years left, don't fight to get slavery. What is important is that we have Christ now. We have salvation now. So don't care about it. Don't let your body trouble you. Don't let anything trouble. The most important is we belong to Christ. But of course, it's easy for him to say, because he didn't have the experience of being a slave. He didn't know how reality was for example, female slaves who had to experience what we would call rape and sexual availability, forced pregnancy, harassment. I don't know, who had to experience that day long. Of course, who was him to say don't let it bother you. He didn't have that experience, and it kind of patronizing in a way to say that you shouldn't care about your problems. I have no idea what your problems are, but you shouldn't care about them. That's the way to not taking seriously that other people really have problems. So that's kind of a problematic statement, to tell slaves not to care, because he's not suffering the same as they are doing. But some scholars say that when Paul called himself a slave of the Lord, he is indirectly identifying with them. That he is identifying with actual slaves when he proclaims he is a slave himself. And that's it's an act of solidarity, some colleagues would say, which I think is a good suggestion. But maybe then we let Paul's text pass too easy. Maybe we should be more critical, also to try to think about how actual slaves who were suffering in this society, how they were getting an additional whatever punishment in order to be slaves of the Lord. Not only were they slaves of their owners, they were supposed to transport that experience into a metaphor to define their relationship to God. I think that's a little bit much to ask, and then also to ask, don't care about it. I think that's it's quite harsh on the slaves, I would say.
And I don't know if this reference will make any sense to you, but the Monty Python movie Life of Brian, where at the end in the crucifixion scene they're singing "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life." But okay, immediately my brain has these associations with what I know of antebellum slavery in the United States, or honestly post-Civil War, like Jim Crow society, or authoritarian or totalitarian regimes where terror, I think the word has been thrown around a lot over the last 25 years, if not longer. So terror being an objective, right? Like your behavior as a high status individual against a lower status individual, intending them to be afraid, and your behavior being not just an assertion of what you see your rights are, but like trying to keep them from acting freely and independently. And I'm thinking of some of Masha Gessen's chronicling of what life was like between the Soviet Union and what we've come now to see under Putin in Russia, where people just start to accept the reality, and there is no such thing as public opinion anymore. And and I understand we're talking about ancient slavery, but people are people, and they all kind of function in the same way. And if you can break someone's independence or autonomy down, which is obviously an objective of enslavement, or certainly something that it benefits from as an institution. So yeah, on the backside of what Paul's saying, or the shadow that's cast behind it, like, yeah, there's a thing you're not knowing, and that's that, like, at any point your bodily autonomy is now irrelevant. That you could go from enjoying your day to your day being ruined, and that there is literally nothing that you can do about that. And on the other hand, trying to remember, Paul is telling all of these people, because yeah, the end is here, but like, you're following Jesus in suffering, and you're following Jesus essentially to crucifixion and resurrection, a shared experience with Jesus. And so like, it's really difficult on this one hand, and it kind of makes sense on this other hand, and I don't know how to bring the two together, and I'm not sure that you do either. That's me just thinking out loud. There's no question there. I'm just thinking out loud.
But I think this is touching upon something that interests me a lot, and that has to do with slavery as, my task is somehow to understand ancient slavery, because that's my sources. But of course, I'm also listening to other places in history where slavery has been relevant or happening. And for me, as someone coming from Europe, we have a very different idea. We do not have, like US, we do not have slavery as, we didn't contribute in that way. We contribute also to this transatlantic slavery, but we had a different role, and not something we're proud of or anything. But in order to understand the context of slavery, and then also I'm interested in this modern slavery that now, specifically NGOs are defining things going on in our world today as slavery, based on exactly this definition that someone owns someone else. It can be debt slaves. It can be victims for trafficking. I mean, that's, and of course also under political regimes that are granted people no rights or no will, and that this somehow trying to identify what is the core of slavery. I think that is without saying it's all the same, because I'm also critical to say that we can use, let's say, modern experiences of slavery. It's basically the same as in the ancient world. Yes and no. It's the same when it comes to you do not own yourself. Your body is somehow someone else's, controls you 100%, can do whatever he or she wants. So I'm very, very interested in all these different experiences in history, and I also use that in my research. Of course, much of in New Testament studies, most of the slavery research comes from US, and of course that's a specific context. It's not my context, but it's a specific context, and I learn a lot from that. But I'm also an outsider to that culture, as I am to the ancient world. But I'm trying to both say that slavery is something we can see a continuum in history and across times and place, but it's also something that has some very specific characteristics in different historical periods. And I know that some of my colleagues think that slavery research in the New Testament today are too dependent on contemporary or recent historical cases, that we have to go more into the ancient world. We can't use the American experience or the trafficking experience. We can't use that for anything to ask questions to the text, because it's such a different system. It's such a different structure. But I would say yes and no. It's both that it is something very specific, historical time and place, but it's also the fact that some people are owned by others. That's really happening. And it's happening today too, which is terrifying. And we also have to, those who hold these texts as sacred texts have to take seriously that New Testament and biblical texts have been used to argue and support slavery, as one of the rationales for why someone should own someone else. Well, the Bible says so. The Bible talks about slaves. Okay, then and said to the slaves, the Bible says so, so you have to be obedient, because the Bible says that about you. That's your role, just as it was at the time of Jesus. So, of course, these texts have some serious reception history issues, but it also has been an impulse for fighting slavery. The Bible had also been an inspiration for those who were enslaved and who fought against slavery across contexts. So that's the way it is with texts. They can be interpreted in so many ways, and they have impulses both for equality and justice, and also for oppression and hierarchies, which makes my discipline difficult but interesting.
I think so. That, I mean, I'll say at the heart of this project that this podcast is the idea that, like, if you are engaging with biblical text in an academic sense or in a liturgical sense or in a devotional sense, that there's a negotiation that's being had there. And I think this is a really good example of that we come to, whether it's from a European or American perspective, you come to the text with a certain set of morals and understandings and values, and great, you do. And then you get to challenge those values, but then you get to challenge the text itself. And so obviously in some cases, Paul is accepting enslavement as it existed around him. And what can we get from that? And obviously Paul is criticizing power in other ways. And what can we get from that? And so what's just kind of winnowing away at what your objectives and your values and all of those things are. That's and a book like this, which there's several types. So yours and Javal Coleman's, I'm just like, wow, in like 10 pages, we're going to go. And yeah, it's an introduction. It's an introduction to the subject, and you guys are continuing to do work, and that is great. But yeah, I'm really appreciative of having this book for the multiple different subjects that it covers. But specifically with regard to your article, was there anything you were hoping I was going to ask about that I have not yet brought up in this conversation?
Oh, there's many things. And I think you mentioned something about this translation issue to servant and slave. and that is something that that's about, translation is a whole separate issue. But I'm concerned about how contemporary readers, what do we want? What do we want with translations? What do we want with the Bible? For example, when we give students or people going to church, when we give them the translation of what difference does it make when we translate it as slave or as servant? For example, when it comes to Mary or Paul, if we translate servant, then it's somehow not giving them associations about slavery in modern times, slavery. I mean, it's somehow it's telling a different narrative. Can I say that? A word is telling a very different narrative. And of course, when we translate from Greek, it's not like it's a one-to-one. We always have to think and interpret and do some choices when we translate. And I think, for example, in Norway, we have last year's translation was the first time where we had slave and not servant. And the argument has always been that people today do not know what slavery is. It doesn't make sense. But not that they know what a servant is, but they know more what a servant is. They have better ideas about that. Doesn't matter what it meant in the ancient world. In order for contemporary people to understand, servant is better than slave. But then some said, well, then you're not translating the text. You're putting into it ideas about what is best in this world or what makes sense in this world. If you want to translate the text, please translate the text, then say slave. So I think this is a discussion of what we want with the text on a deep level. Do we want people to be upset about Mary? Is Mary a slave? What? Or do we want them to be, believing Christians and devoted? Okay, Mary was a model for us to how to believe. I mean, Mary is a model across churches on how to believe. So I mean, that's one of the aspects she's contributing with. So I'm thinking this. I wouldn't say translation is about finding the right word, but translation is a negotiation. And I think that is something when it comes to this complex of slavery. I think that is something we need to take into account. And especially, I talk a lot with my students about this. And I would say that my students here, they understand why they should learn Greek through that discussion. When I present to them what doulos is, this Greek word, and what the translation opportunities are, when I explain that to them, they understand why they should spend a year learning Greek, because that's one of the reasons. You need to be close to the text and you need to be part of that discussion. Okay, what if we translate servant? What do we say then? What if we translate slave? What do we say then? And what is the context in Norway? Okay, they don't know about slavery, but they should know about slavery. Hello, we were part of the slave trade when we were together with Denmark. So it's something about ignoring history or wanting something that is paying into the text. So now I'm very happy that we actually have slave for the first time since last year, that is somehow the established translation. And of course, there have been a discussion. Some people think it's very upsetting because slavery has nothing to do with the Bible, blah, blah, blah. It's all this discussion going on. Yeah, can you imagine? Because
listeners can't see my face, but that was my incredulous face.
Yeah, because they would say that although Paul and Jesus never says anything against slavery, like directly, they would say that ancient slavery is very different. Ancient slavery was much milder. Ancient slavery, the first Christians didn't have slaves and stuff like that, which is not documented. So it's an emotional discussion, also these translation issues.
I mean, there are other, I think it was Chance Bonar's chapter on manumission where he talks about in the early church, they're like, no, we're not going to use church funds for manumission. They were very well aware in the second century of what was happening. The translation thing it's so interesting, right? So I don't know how well this will carry over from American English to Norway, but I've been rewatching this show. It's a comedy show called Future Man, and they end up in this future where it's just kind of slightly different, and they're out in a field and they think they see a person, but it's not. And one of them says, oh, that's like a frightened bird or something. And it's a scarecrow. And so it's like they just it's the same thing, but they just slightly say it differently. I think people do know what a servant is, but then there's also the question of like, well, slavery has nothing to do with the Bible. One, that's factually not correct. But two, I mean, just the chocolate industry alone, it's become obvious to me just recently, but like within the last year or so, like you really can't globally, you really can't buy chocolate without contributing to a labor system that is slavery. It is what we would call slavery. So even if biblical texts it truly had nothing to do with slavery, we do. And so if you're going to this set of texts called the Bible for moral guidance, and you're not making allowances for something that can help us better understand the world that we live in and maybe what our moral obligations within the world are, I think that's a waste. I think that's a missed opportunity. But I am wondering though, so when you say, it almost sounds like you're talking about like a singular Norwegian translation, is this like a centralized church thing, or what is that you're referring to?
Yeah, we have a Bible Society that somehow is translating the official Bible, whatever that is. But it is an NGO. The Bible Society is an NGO, so it's not like a state translation or anything. But it has a status as the official Bible translation, and it's a huge process with, of course, translators, theologians, but also authors and actors. And I mean, it's a whole. We're a small country with 5 million people, so the language is somehow, so everybody's interested in protecting the language, and also as a Bible language because it has some status. So but although we have other translations too, this is more like has the most impact and has most authority. For example, that's the Bible they use in school or at universities or in churches. At least the Protestant church, which is the dominant one. But there are other translations too, but they are more considered unscientific in a way.
That's funny. That's just an example of. I know that there was. I honestly haven't looked into whether or not it still exists. An American Bible Society, which was also, like a nonprofit or an NGO. But it's interesting to kind of realize how foundational entrepreneurial activity is in American society, to where there are any number of organizations in this country who are working on Bible translations into English and then also into other languages. So it's just, wow. Yeah, that is truly interesting, especially with so much of the nativist rhetoric in America right now, that there are so many different Bible translations, and that being such a central book. But thank you for bringing us back around to the servant slave distinction. That's why I threw it out there, even though I had other things I wanted to ask about first. What would you recommend that listeners read, listen to, watch to learn more about the myriad subjects involved in this one topic?
Well, I think the book, the ancient slavery book, that you talk to other authors, yes, with that's really a go-to book, and it's a new book, so I think that's very updated, and it's also very reader friendly because it's for students and it has questions after each chapter and recommended readings at the end. But I think in general that this is a topic that scholars are still discussing. So if people are really interested in research updates, go to libraries or search online at Google or at whatever. No, not necessarily scholar platforms where they will get really proof quality.
So Google Scholar, JSTOR, things like that.
Or we recommend often local libraries, but that's in Norway. But I don't know. I would have some academic framing if people are interested in really the what do you say, the quality, that it's peer reviewed. I mean, that it's really read by other scholars. So because there's a lot of things out there. So go to libraries.
So I don't know that this as a resource translate over, but I know, like, in many instances in the United States, a community college library will. I know here in Houston, it's part of the county library system. And so going in there, you can talk to a librarian who is trained and they work for the college. And so that may be a thing for people to look into. That's both the local library and it has the academic credentials behind it.
Exactly. That's good. It's good. I love libraries so much and I love librarians so much. They are best friends. So yes, absolutely.
What do you read for fun?
Poetry, Swedish and Danish and Norwegian poetry.
Anybody in particular you'd like us to?
Well, I don't know if it's translated. There's a Swedish last century poet called Edith Södergran. I'm just reading her now. She died at the age of 30 and wrote all her poems from she was 20 to 30. And it's fantastic. It's so deep, so terrible, and so beautiful. Edith Södergran, my recommendation.
So, hold on. So you say so terrible and so beautiful. I know I have my sense of what that means. What do you mean by that?
I mean that she probably knew she was going to die in her mid 20s, and she writes about life and death in such a painful way, so deep and so full of wisdom, although she was just a young girl. So I don't know, and it's also very, very full of nature motifs and full of complicated relationships and love and sexuality and everything, and it's just very beautiful. And Swedish language, I mean, it's impossible to translate, but that's a very beautiful, very poetic language.
What's what are the limiting factors of translating? So I know nothing about this, so I'm
No,
truly
no,
curious.
it's just that the translation in general, it's or to say it another way, I'm very happy as a Norwegian I can read Danish and Swedish because it's also similar, so I can read the original. But I'm sure that even in translation, these poems are very beautiful.
Okay, well, I will have that in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here today. Do you have anything else for us?
No, just want to encourage people to be curious. And if there are things they don't like in the world, find out why it's the way it is and fight for a better solution. I think that's my last message.
Okay, that's a good one to have. Marianne, Bjelland, Kartzow, thank you so much for sitting down with me. Take care.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks so much for listening. Next week on the podcast, Tommy Woodward and I will be talking about comedy, humor, laughter. I really enjoyed that conversation for a number of reasons. It was educational about the ancient world, about Philo of Alexandria, about ancient humor, but it was also an opportunity for me to bring up some of the stuff that I really think is funny. So I'll have a quick preview of my conversation with him in a moment. Before that, though, if you're listening to the free episode version of this, you could go become a supporter on Patreon for $5 a month and hear this interview now. 10 days early is when they come out. So the Monday before they are released for free. You can hear this episode now. You can also just subscribe wherever it is that you're listening. That would go a huge way, bringing up those numbers, getting me more attention. I am trying to build this podcast without any of the many algorithm hacks that are out there. And I don't mean hacks in the hack comedy sense. I mean, algorithms have been designed that you have to utilize them. And building an audience without them is a lot more work. And I don't know if it's that I have integrity or that I'm stubborn. Maybe it's both. But it is important to me to build an audience as organically as I possibly can, which means I'm swimming upstream. So the more likes, the more follows, the more reviews, the more feedback that I can get from you in those public spaces, whether it's, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, Audible, iHeartRadio, Player FM, Listen Notes, Podchaser, Boomplay. I'd never even heard of Boomplay before I started making a podcast, but podcasts go out there. Also, Podbean. The podcast is available on Podbean. That is where I push my podcasts out. That's the site that hosts me. You could go to any of those places and subscribe and leave comments and all kinds of things. Shoot me an email if you actually want me to get that feedback. I don't always get a notification that someone has commented. And if I do, it does not happen in a timely manner. But you can email me at itmeanswhatitmeans at gmail.com. All one word, it means what it means at gmail.com. If you have any feedback or guest suggestions, maybe you'd like to be on the podcast and there's something you want to come on and discuss, just make sure you have something in hand that I can review to be able to begin a conversation with, and not just, hey, I want to talk to you about this topic. But if you send that and I think it's interesting, it'll probably be something that I will have you on for. Yeah, I think that's it. So here is a preview of my conversation with Tommy Woodward, which will be available next week. Or, again, for $5 a month, you can hear it now over on Patreon. If you get a chance to love someone, you should take it. Take care.
And so when you look at Embassy to Gaius and how Philo uses laughter in it, you start to see a few common tropes, right? One is that the Jewish population of Alexandria is being laughed at by their enemies for no good reason, right? And if laughter acts as a punishment for wrongdoing or being the wrong sort of person, why would the Jews be laughed at if, in Philo's point of view, they have done nothing to earn that type of laughter? Well, we need some other explanation. And Philo's explanation is that Egyptians are cruel and animalistic, and they will lash out against others like the Jews of Alexandria with laughter as a weapon. And so he really describes Egyptians as these cruel people who want to laugh at Jews for no good reason, and who will do that unless they are stopped by a greater power.